Picture a zebra. Not in a zoo, not in a wildlife documentary with calming narration, but on the actual African savanna, doing what zebras spend most of their time doing, which is eating grass and trying very hard not to become something else's lunch. Now imagine that a lion appears. Within seconds, the zebra is running for its life, its cardiovascular system operating at something close to maximum capacity, its muscles flooded with glucose and oxygen, its entire physiology redirected toward one singular biological priority: do not die in the next 3 minutes. Now here is the interesting part. If the zebra escapes, and statistically most zebras do escape because lions are actually not that efficient and the savanna is large, something remarkable happens. The zebra stops running, walks over to a patch of grass, and starts eating again. Not after a therapy session, not after processing the trauma with a trusted social support network, not after lying awake at 3 in the morning replaying the lion encounter and wondering if it could have run faster or whether the lion thought less of it. The zebra just eats grass. The stress response fires, does its job, and then turns off. Clean activation, clean resolution, back to baseline. You, on the other hand, do not do this. You activate the same stress response because you have the same stress response built on the same evolutionary chassis running the same hormonal software, but you activate it for things that are not lions. You activate it for things that have not happened yet and may never happen. You activate it for things that happened years ago and are not happening now. You activate it for abstract symbols, numbers on a screen representing your bank balance, words in an email from your manager, a news headline about something occurring thousands of miles away that you can do absolutely nothing about. You activate it for imagined social humiliations that exist nowhere except inside your own skull. And then, crucially, you do not turn it off. Because the thing activating it does not resolve. Because you keep thinking about it. Because unlike the zebra, you have a cerebral cortex capable of generating psychological stress indefinitely, independent of any actual external threat, at 3 in the morning when you should be asleep. This is the central defining catastrophe of modern human physiology. Not the stress response itself, which is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, but the fact that we run it chronically, in response to psychological and social threats that do not resolve in 3 minutes, using a biological system that was designed exclusively for physical threats that do. The result is a species that is slowly, systematically, quite thoroughly destroying itself with its own stress hormones. And the zebra, eating grass calmly in the middle distance, is doing absolutely fine. Let's go back to the beginning, because the elegance of the stress response deserves proper appreciation before we get to the part where it kills you. The moment a threat is perceived, and we will come back to the word perceived because it carries enormous weight, the hypothalamus initiates a 2-track emergency response. The first track is fast. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline and its close relative, directly into the bloodstream. This happens in seconds. Heart rate surges, blood pressure climbs sharply. The bronchioles in the lungs dilate, increasing airflow. Blood is redistributed from the skin and digestive organs toward the large skeletal muscles that will do the running or fighting. Glucose pours out of storage in the liver and muscles into circulation, providing immediate fuel. The spleen contracts, squeezing out a reserve of red blood cells to increase the oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood. Clotting factors are released, preparing for the possibility of injury. Pain sensitivity drops. Digestion stops. Sexual function stops. Immune surveillance at the acute level actually gets a brief boost, mobilizing immune cells to the periphery in anticipation of potential wounds before stress suppression of immunity kicks in at the chronic level. This is the body going from 0 to emergency in under 30 seconds. It is extraordinary. Every system that matters for immediate survival gets enhanced. Everything else gets shut down. The engineering is impeccable. The second track is slightly slower. The hypothalamus activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which is the endocrine arm of the stress response. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, which travels to the pituitary gland and triggers the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream, which travels to the adrenal cortex and stimulates the production and release of cortisol. This whole cascade takes minutes rather than seconds, and cortisol's effects unfold over a longer time frame than adrenaline's. Cortisol mobilizes additional energy stores, enhances the cardiovascular effects of adrenaline, modulates immune function, and crucially, helps the brain consolidate memories of the stressful event so you remember what nearly killed you and can avoid it in the future. Smart system, elegant system, works beautifully for zebras. Now here is where the cardiovascular story gets specific, because heart disease is not a vague or metaphorical consequence of stress. It is a mechanical one, with identifiable biological steps connecting the stress response to the damaged artery. Every time the sympathetic nervous system fires and blood pressure surges, the walls of the arteries experience increased mechanical stress. The endothelial cells lining the inner surface of arteries are sensitive to this pressure, and repeated surges cause microdamage to the endothelial lining. The body responds to this damage with inflammation, the same basic repair response it uses for any tissue injury. Inflammatory cells migrate to the site of damage. Low-density lipoprotein cholesterol circulating in the blood gets trapped in these inflamed areas and begins to oxidize. Macrophages engulf the oxidized LDL and become engorged, forming foam cells. The foam cells accumulate and begin forming the fatty streaks that develop into atherosclerotic plaques, the hardened, cholesterol-laden deposits that narrow the arteries and restrict blood flow. Cortisol contributes to this process in several ways. It promotes the deposition of visceral fat, the metabolically active abdominal fat that is specifically associated with elevated cardiovascular risk, by stimulating fat storage in that region. It elevates blood glucose through gluconeogenesis, producing conditions that over time promote insulin resistance and diabetes, both of which further accelerate atherosclerosis. It suppresses the immune system in ways that paradoxically allow certain inflammatory processes relevant to plaque formation to proceed unchecked, while compromising others that would normally be protective. And it directly affects the heart muscle, which under sustained sympathetic activation and elevated glucocorticoids experiences wear that, over years and decades, degrades its function. The zebra, who activates this entire system occasionally and briefly, incurs the acute costs and reaps the survival benefits without accumulating the chronic damage. You, who activate it repeatedly, and at length in response to mortgage anxiety and difficult colleagues and the general ambient uncertainty of modern existence, accumulate the damage without most of the survival benefits because the mortgage is not actually trying to eat you, and running would not help anyway. There is also the clotting story, which is worth telling separately because it is particularly instructive. During acute stress, clotting factors are released into the circulation as preparation for the wounds that physical confrontation with a predator might produce. This is sensible. If a lion is about to bite you, pre-deploying clotting factors means you bleed less when it does. But if you activate this response repeatedly in the absence of actual wounds, what you are doing is periodically thickening your blood with clotting factors that have nowhere useful to go. And thickened, clot-prone blood moving through arteries that are being progressively narrowed by atherosclerotic plaques produces exactly the conditions for a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, when a clot forms in a coronary artery and cuts off blood supply to the heart muscle. The stress response did not cause the heart attack through some vague and general mechanism. It caused it through a specific, traceable, step-by-step biological sequence that begins with the amygdala perceiving a threat and ends with a clot in a coronary artery. Now we need to talk about what the amygdala actually responds to, because this is where the zebra and the human diverge most dramatically, and it is not primarily a matter of willpower or attitude or learning to relax. It is a matter of cortical architecture. The amygdala, in all mammals, responds to sensory inputs associated with threat, the sight of a predator, the smell of a predator, sounds associated with danger. These are direct, concrete, present-tense sensory signals. The amygdala is very good at responding to them quickly and without much deliberation, which is precisely what you want in a system designed to save your life in emergencies. Fast and non-deliberate is the whole point. But the human amygdala also receives dense projections from the prefrontal cortex and other cortical regions, which means it can be activated not just by present sensory threats, but by thoughts, memories, anticipations, and abstractions generated by the cortex. Your cortex can think about next month's rent payment and generate a signal in the amygdala that is functionally similar to the signal generated by an actual predator. Your cortex can replay an embarrassing conversation from 3 years ago and produce a stress response. Your cortex can read a disturbing news article and activate the HPA axis. Your cortex can imagine a conversation that has not happened yet and generate cortisol. No other animal does this at anything like the scale humans do. Chimpanzees, with their considerable cognitive sophistication, do not lie awake generating psychological stress about abstract futures. They have concerns, certainly, social status, food availability, predators. But those concerns are concrete and present tense. They do not project years into the future and stress about retirement. They do not ruminate for hours about what another chimpanzee meant by a particular facial expression last Tuesday. They do not read the news. The cortex that allows you to plan decades into the future, to learn from the experiences of people you have never met, to think abstractly about mortality and meaning and the eventual heat-death of the universe. This same cortex is also running your amygdala on things that would not register as threats to any other animal on the planet. The cognitive sophistication that makes you capable of the full range of human achievement is the same cognitive sophistication that is generating the psychological stress that is giving you atherosclerosis. There is a social gradient to all of this that deserves explicit attention because stress is not randomly distributed across the population and neither is heart disease. The most robust predictor of cardiovascular disease risk in humans is not diet. It is not smoking, though smoking is terrible. It is not exercise habits, though those matter. It is socioeconomic status. People lower in the socioeconomic hierarchy have significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and the relationship is graded. It is not just poor versus rich, but a continuous gradient from the bottom to the top, with each step down the hierarchy associated with incrementally higher cardiovascular risk. And the mechanism is stress. Specifically, the chronic, uncontrollable, unpredictable stress of lower socioeconomic status. The financial insecurity, the lack of control over working conditions, the housing instability, the exposure to environmental hazards, the daily experience of operating in a society that signals your lower status through 100 small and large mechanisms. The cardiovascular system of someone low in a social hierarchy is running a sustained low-grade stress response that their cardiovascular system was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The plaques accumulate. The clotting factors do their slow work. The heart muscle experiences its chronic wear, and none of it is because of bad choices or insufficient effort at stress management. It is because the conditions of their life are activating a biological system in a way that system was not designed to be activated. The fascinating and horrible baboon data is instructive here. Baboon troops have clear dominance hierarchies, and the physiological correlates of rank have been studied extensively. Low-ranking male baboons have chronically elevated basal cortisol levels, suppressed immune function, lower HDL cholesterol, higher blood pressure, and higher rates of atherosclerosis than high-ranking males, not because of their diet, which is essentially identical, but because of the chronic psychosocial stress of low status. The stress of being subordinate, of having less control, less predictability, more exposure to threat and harassment from dominant individuals, produces measurable cardiovascular damage. The biological pathway from social status to heart disease runs through the stress response, and it runs in baboons for the same reason it runs in humans, because the underlying physiology is the same. This is uncomfortable information for a society that prefers to think of health outcomes as primarily the product of individual choices and personal responsibility. It is considerably more comfortable to tell people to eat less saturated fat and exercise more than to acknowledge that the social conditions in which people live are biologically inscribed in They're cardiovascular tissue, but the arteries do not care about comfort. They respond to cortisol and to blood pressure surges and to inflammatory cascades, regardless of whether we find the source of those signals politically convenient to acknowledge. So, what does the zebra know that you do not? Strictly speaking, nothing. The zebra has no knowledge, no insight, no philosophical perspective on the stress response. The zebra simply has a brain that cannot generate psychological stress about abstract futures, a social world that is stressful in concrete and episodic ways rather than chronic and inescapable ones, and a stress response that therefore activates and resolves the way it was designed to. What you have, that the zebra does not, is a prefrontal cortex capable of understanding all of this, of recognizing that the stress response you are running right now, in response to something that is not physically present and may never materialize, is activating the same biological cascade that is, over time, through specific and traceable mechanisms, damaging your cardiovascular system. The zebra cannot know any of this. You can. Whether knowing it changes anything depends on factors that are themselves partly biological, partly environmental, partly social. On the architecture of your prefrontal cortex, on the conditions of your life, on whether you have the resources and stability to actually implement what understanding suggests, which is its own kind of biological irony. The knowledge is available. The application of the knowledge is subject to all the same constraints as everything else. The zebra, unburdened by this particular irony, is still eating grass, blood pressure normal, cortisol resolved, arteries intact, completely unaware of how enviable this is.